Wrong. I'm Charlie. Welcome to Moving Home with Charlie, and thank you for coming.
Charlie Landing grew up in Sussex, is the founder of Best Agent and presenter of Moving Home with Charlie.
If you want to find one of these guys, look out for those compassionate professionals. All estate agents are not the same.
So Charlie, what would be your advice for people interested in buying new builds right now?
Don't overpay. Do buy, but don't overpay. That's why I say disregard the guff. Read into the numbers and look, and it's buried. The bad news is buried in the small print, okay?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Property Press Awards.
They may or may not be telling the truth, but you should form your own view. Get out and view, get out and view, get out and view. You cannot be in a position to make offers and have no offers accepted if you're not viewing. So be out there viewing. Pay attention to the back of the class if you've not been watching my videos. I did one just a couple of days ago. Disregard the guff, guys. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on Moving Home with Charlie. I'm Charlie Lambden, and today we are talking about Section 21 no-fault evictions, landlords, and homelessness. And I'm very happy to have a guest who is a friend of mine. He's a specialist lettings agent from Shoreditch in London, who's one of the agents I have the highest respect for in the industry. We have some conflicting views on certain areas, but he's a guy who really knows his stuff. And in a few minutes, he'll be joining us so that he and I can duke it out over Section 21, because in a nutshell, he doesn't think that, and Kristjan, correct me if I misrepresent you here, doesn't think that ending Section 21 is actually going to help much, but I do. Now, let me just give a background first, then a bit of data that I've got, and then we'll get into a conversation. It is my opinion and feeling that if somebody chooses to be a landlord, they are choosing to get into the business, the operational hands-on business of providing a home as a service. Okay? People who rent cars don't just rent the car and leave you to it. They are required to maintain the car and service the car and provide you with a replacement if it goes wrong and that kind of stuff. It's a hands-on operational business. They don't just buy the cars and expect a return on their investment without any effort or operational requirement. And I think this is the root cause of a lot of the problems in the industry. So, roughly speaking, you've got a real spectrum of landlords, but at the good end of the spectrum of landlords, you've got landlords who understand that what they are doing is not just providing a home, but providing stability and security for people to actually build and make progress with their lives. And especially families where there are children living there as well. The children's life chances are as affected as the parents, if not more so, by unexpected no-fault evictions where families are, through no fault of their own, suddenly told, you've got to move out, sometimes with as little as 2 months' notice. Recently, with the rise of cheap buy-to-let mortgages and the advent of lots of what I call Instagram landlords who are being sold this dream of financial freedom with investment, and you don't even need any money to start. We've ended up across the country with a lot of these landlords, these sort of party landlords that I call them, who really just think that it is an investment to be a landlord rather than actually an obligation from one human being to another to provide a comfortable and secure place to live. And they think, well, it's my money. I want my money back, or you can get out. I want to sell up because I want the financial convenience of being able to switch my investment around. Well, for those particular landlords, it is my view that they are seeking financial freedom at the expense of their tenants' financial freedom, because people who need to earn a living to pay the bills and pay the rent need a secure place to live in order to earn their living and pay their bills and pay their rent. And when they are moved around because a landlord decides he wants to sell, although I have to admit that there are some reasons landlords are selling up now that weren't there before, and we'll come on to that. Yeah, life is hard enough for most people just to pay the rent and get to work and do everything you've got to do, especially with the cost of living crisis. So when you get blindsided by a landlord who maybe they can't afford their mortgage anymore because they overstretched themselves, thinking that this was a good investment, but now it no longer is. Or maybe whatever their reason might be, the landlords who simply want to kick you out because of financial convenience or because they're worried they can't get their property back if the law changes. Well, I think that it is a very valid argument to say that what's more important, your investment as a landlord or someone's life chances? And let's just get into a couple of numbers here now, because the most recent numbers I've got here, I've got so this is from London, okay, and this is the website is london.gov.uk, section 21 evictions, and this is from December last year, and in a quarter, there were almost 6,000 households threatened with homelessness due to a Section 21 notice. And that's just in London, okay? And this morning on the BBC, there was a story out about how charities are concerned over the lack of progress with the Renters Reform Bill. One of the steps in the Renters Reform Bill is going to be the abolition of Section 21. And this was initially promised by Theresa May back in 2018 or 19, I think. So it's been 4 years since then, and it still hasn't happened. And they're going on to say that they're worried that there are concerns the bill will not have time to pass through Parliament before the next election, which is expected to take place next year. Now, as my regular viewers will know, my stated mission and goal is a home for everyone. And I'm just hoping that what I'm doing will contribute to that outcome one day. So my main goal here is to help people who want to move house more easily, whether you're buying or whether you're renting. But also I take an interest in what's happening in homelessness. And homelessness is a massive and rapidly increasing problem. And I just want to show you again, before I get into the conversation with Kristjan, what the government's own figures here are. And I wanted to know, what is the number one? There is a long list of causes of homelessness. And by this, I mean statutory homelessness. So this is statutory homelessness is when a council accepts their obligation to prevent you becoming homeless. Okay, so the actual numbers are a lot bigger than this, but this is the official data here. And on this graph, and I've got a link to this below, right? I'll read this paragraph first. The most common reason for the threatened loss of last settled home was due to the end of their private rented assured shorthold tenancy. Sorry, I'll get this up on the screen for you. At 31,300 households, or 51% of households with children owed a prevention duty. More than half of households owed a prevention duty by the council, more than half of them are caused by the end of a private rented AST. This is the no fault end of it. It's not because they broke or got into arrears. It is a landlord deciding that they want to sell, or something similar like that. So while overall households with children owed a prevention duty has increased by 8% from last year, the end of private rented AST has increased by 20%. Now that I know is due to the proposed changes in the law and landlords wanting to get out before the rental reform bill comes, or people who just want to sell up for other financial reasons. The majority of private rented ASTs ended due to the landlord wishing to sell or re-let the property at 68%, an increase of 20% compared to the last year. All right. So the point is, there is no question that landlords choosing to end a tenancy, not because there's anything wrong with the tenant, but for other reasons, is the number one cause of homelessness instances where a council is required to then temporarily house that family. So basically, the taxpayer is picking up the bill for people who are left homeless because a landlord wanted to sell up. And I'm getting close to wrapping up now, so Kristjan can come in and talk about this. I don't think people should get into being a landlord unless it's because you want to provide long-term housing for your tenants. If you just want to get in to make a bit of money for a few years and then get out, well, okay, but understand that if you do that, you are going to be substantially disadvantaging people. If you say, hey, it's not my problem, the law allows me to get them out of this property because I need to sell it. Well, they're going to be homeless. Not my problem. Oh, the council's going to have to pay for their temporary accommodation. Not my problem. I'm a landlord, not my problem. Now, not all landlords are like this. It's very important. There are a lot of landlords I know who have simply because of their own personal standards, would never put a tenant in that situation. In fact, there was one on TV recently being interviewed saying he is selling up his entire portfolio, but he's not doing it until tenants are leaving of their own voluntary accord because they want to leave. So he basically said, as the tenants are leaving, then he's putting them up for sale. I think he's sold something like 2/3 of them, but the other third has still got tenants in there. And he's not going to kick them out just so he can sell, because he just thinks that that's a shitty thing to do. And I agree. So to wrap up, I don't think you should be a landlord unless you understand you are in the business of providing long-term housing. If you are a landlord, taking a long-term view leads to lower voids and turnarounds, and therefore higher long-term returns anyway. But just on a human level, I think placing one's financial interests over the life chances of someone else, to me, is fundamentally wrong. Good landlords have a place and should be welcomed and should be allowed to make a living as a landlord. But in and out, switching my investment around type landlords who had leveraged up to the hilt and now have to put the rent up, or they have to kick you out, that needs to be ended. And so that's what I think is a good thing. Right, I will shut up now. Please bring your questions if they're on this topic in the live chat. But Kristjan, now I'd like to introduce Kristjan. Hello, Kristjan. Welcome.
Hey, Charlie. Thanks for having me back.
Kristjan has two professional hats in the lettings industry. Number one, he is the owner of Base Property Services, which is a specialist lettings business in Shoreditch in London, and therefore the majority of your life is running your lettings business. Kristjan also founded one of the coolest pieces of technology in the property sector, which is called the Depositary. Basically, it speeds up the deposit recovery process at the end of tenancy. Amongst other things, it speeds up the wrapping up of all the admin, so tenants get the deposits back sooner. It's less work for the agents and for the landlords. It's a win-win-win, and it's a beautiful piece of technology and a beautiful example of technology used well that benefits everybody. And therefore, here is a man who understands lettings and the law around lettings and the actual real life practical realities of ending a tenancy as well. Although, to be fair, Kristjan, your personal thing is in Shoreditch, which nationally speaking is a pretty high end in terms of lettings, isn't it, in terms of prices. But your tenancy client, your depository clients are agents all around the country, aren't they?
That's right. So yeah, my lettings agency is London centric. I'd say we sit in the middle of the market. I think our current rent sits at around 2,300 a month at the moment. I think an important third hat that I wear is that I have been and still am a tenant myself. I've rented in London for 25 years and counting. And in that time lived in, I think, 12 different homes, predominantly through letting agents, not our own operation. So I've also very much, have been and still am a private tenant myself as well. So I very much understand, the tenant experience as well.
Okay, but so you don't think abolishing Section 21 is worth doing? Am I right?
Okay, so let's pick apart a couple of the things in the bit you said. So statistics and data is always an interesting way to look at these. So looking at the correlation between a Section 21 notice and accounts having to step in as homelessness, there is a fallacy to that data. And the fallacy being is that if you have a tenant that wants to be rehoused by the council, that wants to move into social or council provided housing, most councils have such a staggering backlog that they will only rehouse a tenant if they are evicted from a property. And therefore, I can tell you, over the nearly 20 years we run our lettings agency, we have had many instances over the years where we've had a tenant approach us and say, guys, I desperately need to move into social housing through the council. I've been told by the council that I cannot leave the property. I have to be evicted. Can we please start that process? And over the last 20 years, I can think of at least 15 cases. And to be fair, we've been going a long time, but we have a relatively small portfolio. We look after about 300 tenancies. We've had probably about 15 cases where the tenant has come to us and we've gone, fine, we'll serve the Section 21 notice. We'll wait for that to elapse. You don't move out. The landlord will then need to file court papers to enact the Section 21 and have you evicted, and we've had to go through that whole process. Obviously, the tenant doesn't contest it because they want to be evicted, because only once they are evicted can they be rehoused by the council. So you will always see a correlation between Section 21s and the statistical data put out of homelessness by councils, because they force landlords and letting agents to evict tenants in order to rehouse them. There was a rather meaningless agreement, a verbal agreement made by all the councils a few years ago that they weren't going to do this anymore. But the simple fact of the matter is their backlogs of housing are so dire that they have to house people on a case-by-case emergency basis. And so we are forced into a situation where landlords and letting agents, often in complete understanding with the tenant, have to go through that process to evict a tenant because the tenant wants to and is eligible for council provided housing at a much lower fee. So when looking at the statistical data about the correlation between Section 21 and homelessness as classified by a council, that needs to be something taken into account, is the fact that that is very simply, for a lot of tenants already in private housing, that is the only way for them to secure council housing.
And so you're saying that that's a tenant who's basically saying, I can't afford to live here anymore.
Exactly. For whatever reason, they've lost their job, they've had a change in circumstance, they've decided to have a change in life circumstances, whatever it is, whatever the situation is that has caused that person to want or need the affordable housing provided by a council. For most councils in the UK, the only way for that person to be housed is to be evicted from the property. And therefore, the cleanest way to do that is through a Section 21 expedited hearing and then through a court-appointed bailiff. And like I said, I can think of at least 10 to 15 cases over the years where we've done that in complete open cooperation with the tenant, right, because that's what they've needed and that's the only way to make it happen. So,
and by comparison,
yeah.
But by comparison, Kristjan, so 10 to 15 cases over the years, how many landlords have you had who've decided they want to sell and have then asked their tenants to leave, even though the tenant didn't want to leave?
Virtually none. Now, Charlie, as you know, our approach to agency, we launched our agency because when Anne and I launched the agency, it was primarily for two driving factors. The first was that we felt that landlords were generally getting a poor deal in the market, but actually the biggest driver was that we felt that tenants were treated appallingly in general by the industry, and we felt there was something different to do there. And we've put that at the very core of our business, and we aim to attract the very landlords you talk about. We aim to attract landlords who are in it for the long game. Most of our landlords have been with us for over a decade. We look to secure tenants who stay long. We always educate our landlords on better keeping a good tenant that you know, rather than potentially losing them for a small increase in rent. And yeah, so look, we very much look to go out and find landlords that are in it for the long game, do take a very serious, considered approach about what they are providing, how that property is maintained.
Kristjan, you know as well as I do that
with 200 properties, and we threw him out within a month because it quickly became very apparent that he just wasn't willing to fulfill his obligations as a landlord during any of the tenancies. So that my experience is slightly tainted by the fact that I like to think we deal with the kind of landlords most tenants would want to rent through, both in terms of their attitude and the condition of their property. But I also have a very good understanding of how the market operates as a whole.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. So for the purposes of this conversation and for the people who are watching all over the country,
yeah,
let's just you are an unusually good letting agent. You have an unusually good class of landlord because those are the ones that you've approached, and you will fire bad landlords quite rightly. But around the country, first of all, there are some shocking lettings agents.
Yeah,
I know you know that, right?
Yeah.
And obviously some very, very poor landlords who have a horrific attitude to tenants.
Yes.
And I know, there are people, because there are countless stories about people who are asked to move out of a property when they don't want to, even though they're fully paid. I mean, the reason I know this is because when I was talking to local councils down here in Devon and Dorset about their homeless problem, they said the number one problem was the number one thing was, and I don't take away from what you've just said about tenants saying, "Look, I need the Section 21 process in order to get a house," but and maybe there is definitely an overlap, but where tenants didn't want to leave, they did not want to leave, they didn't want to be moved at all, and they're probably all going to end up in temporary accommodation rather than council or social accommodation. It's a real problem because I just
Okay,
think that.
so let's talk about the reasons a landlord would end, right? So and let's tie it into the context of the Renters Reform Bill. So there are going to be protected measures. A landlord is likely to retain the right to reoccupy either by themselves or an immediate family. I don't think anyone could safely argue out there that if someone who owns a property finds themselves in a circumstance where they need to move back into that property because that is their only home, I don't think anyone can legitimately argue against that. There needs to be
No, none of it's their only
notice.
home. But sorry, that's not a landlord for the purposes of this discussion. That's someone who's had to let out their home because maybe they've gone abroad for a couple of years. But then that's when you would do a fixed term tenancy.
That is most landlords, Charlie. This is what people need to understand. Most landlords are one or two property owners. They are not portfolio landlords. Portfolio
Yeah, but it's not their home.
Are the exception, not the. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter why most landlords, that one or two properties they own is a former home of theirs, more often than not. More often than not, it's a property that they owned that when they got together with a partner or they got a decent promotion at work, they moved into another property and were in a fortunate enough position to be able to keep that home, but transition it into a rental property. So a lot of landlords come into it out of fortuity of circumstance, rather than an intentional strategic sort of investment. And look, there's a lot of tie-in between that circumstance and a lot of what you've talked about the attitudes that people take about what it is they're undertaking. But it is really important, there's roughly 4 million PRS properties in the UK. There are roughly 2 million landlords. Very simple mathematics there, 2 properties per person, but there are portfolio landlords. So the reality is that number will impact that. So your average landlord is 1 to 1.5 properties, and that's probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the market.
Sorry, I think it's important whether it's a home or not.
Landlords have 10 plus properties. That is not the norm.
No, I know, but I completely accept that if it's because a landlord's got to move back in for their home, they should be able to do that, but with more than 2 months' notice. I think with that, it needs to be an absolute minimum 6 months' notice.
So, okay, Charlie, but devil's advocate, that the owner of that property is facing dire financial circumstances themselves. What you're saying is they might not be able to plan 6 months ahead. So you're saying the landlord should be made homeless because the tenant should be given more notice. I don't think that's fair. I think there should be a balance. I think 3 months notice, I think it should be increased to 3 months notice for circumstances like that. But I don't see that 6 months is necessarily going to change anything for a tenant because they're still tied in to that contractual period. That 6 month notice would still end on a specific date. Okay, so that tenant is still going to be obligated to pay that rent up until that point, unless the landlord lets them go earlier. So that 6 months doesn't necessarily help them find a home because they still, in theory, need to find a home that ties into that contractual period. So they're still going to have a limited window of opportunity of what is on the market that meets their budget, that meets their needs, and is going to meet that time frame. So I don't necessarily know that tripling the notice is going to change anything substantially. It might feel a bit less pressured. And I appreciate, as someone who's got 2 kids, especially when you factor in kids into the situation and you're talking about schools and catchment areas and everything else, I get it. I'm not saying any of this is light.
2 months is not enough. It's just not enough. 2 months is plainly not enough to, with a family and children and schools to relocate and stuff. It's just not enough
I
to
just
find
think
somewhere.
also 6 months is probably pushing it too far the other way. So, but
I mean, I think the instances of landlords in financial distress are probably a tiny fraction of the instances of tenants in financial distress. I mean,
given a lot of your content recently, Charlie, about mortgage rates and a lot of the talk you've been doing about the property market, I would argue right now that's not the situation. I'd say there's a lot of landlords right now in quite severe financial distress because of what's happened to the mortgage rate market.
Right. Okay.
Coupled with ridiculous government legislation like Section 24.
Right.
Let's make no mistake.
So,
the current rental crisis is not landlord caused. It's
no, I agree that. Yeah. So it's important that I say this. I think that the recent legislation changes on tax, that kind of stuff, have been very ill advised. I think shelter has not helped with the lobbying at all. Rent controls do not work. It's a silly idea. Section 24. They have. I mean, if their intention was to drive out small landlords, and they've done the right, then it's working. But obviously, that's made the rental crisis worse. It definitely has, and I agree with you that most of that legislation has been very badly thought through and even more poorly implemented.
The trouble is, you've got tenant rights action groups, which look fundamentally are needed in the marketplace. There needs to be people defending tenant rights. Have managed to convince the government that something needs to happen, something needs to change. And where the government have really failed the British public is they have decided, although it now looks like they're now doing an about turn on it, but they decided, and Michael Gove was very open about the fact that they were very intentionally seeking to shrink the PRS. The problem, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. The problem with that is there wasn't any plan to solve an alternate solution. There wasn't a plan to suddenly build 1 million social homes. No. There wasn't a plan to suddenly say, right, first-time buyers, the government will cover a 30% deposit for you, or whatever. I mean, I'm throwing out ridiculous things here, but the point is there was nothing to solve reducing supply.
To go back to your point about the landlords being stressed by mortgage rates. So what I think is really important is any landlord I'm not talking about accidental landlords here. I'm not talking about people who ended up renting out their home. I'm talking about people who chose to get into it as an investment strategy. People who chose to take out a buy-to-let mortgage to buy a property to let it out. That is an investment decision. Okay. And if you make investments, you take you are rolling the dice. So I don't think if your mortgage is now too much to afford, okay, you rolled the dice. They didn't go your way. Interest rates went back, and that's bad. And you need to sell up if you can't afford your mortgage. You over leveraged. You didn't factor in the risks. Because even with rents rising, if you can't afford the mortgage payment because the rent's high, then you were over leveraged by definition. It's not even a matter of opinion. It's like your rent is no longer enough to cover your mortgage on your buy to let. By definition, you over leveraged.
So let's talk about a few things. So first of all, this idea that there are landlords that buy a property, keep it for 1 to 2 years, and then sell it for a big profit. They don't exist. There is no landlord out there, even 100% cash in this market, that can buy a property, rent it for 2 years, sell it, and walk away with a penny of profit.
Kristjan, I'm afraid I've had a paid video call. I had someone who bought an hour with me who'd done exactly that problem, and their problem was they couldn't sell it. They said, I bought it just to put my money somewhere from my divorce. I wanted to put my money in somewhere. I thought I'd buy a flat and rent it out for a couple of years, and then I'd be able to sell it and get my money back.
Because, Charlie, but they haven't done it, and that's the point. There is no landlord buys a property with a view to flip it in 2 years who understands the market, all right? Because there is, once you factor in the tax liability, it eliminates, I mean, Jesus, unless you buy a property that doubles in value in 2 years, which, let's be honest, short of discovering a gold mine at the foot end of your garden, or us going through another pandemic and a bizarre market created out the back end of it, let's talk real market terms. You can't turn a property around in 2 years as a rental property and walk away with money at the end of it. So this idea that there are landlords who en masse are thinking short term, 2 or 3 years on a property, pardon my French, but bollocks. They don't exist.
No. Sorry,
So,
Kristjan, I don't suggest that. I don't think there are large numbers who want to flip it in 2 years. What I
I'm
do
not
think is
saying
that there are
you. I'm
large
saying
numbers
that
of retail
there is
buy-to-let landlords who thought that they
that
could make
there is a general
financial freedom out
dialogue
of it.
about certain behaviours of landlords, which I don't think are rooted in real world. There is a lot of talk about landlords online who go into flip properties. It's nonsense. There are no landlords out there making big money out of flipping properties.
No, I
Okay?
agree. I don't think that's a problem.
There are landlords. There is this whole dialogue about landlords use Section 21 to remove a good tenant on a slightly below market rent because they think they can get 5% more. Again, bollocks. The average time you place a tenancy, the average property will be empty 4 to 6 weeks between a tenancy, even in this market. There will be other costs. You will need to go in and repaint a wall, replace a sofa, whatever it is. You will have requests from those tenants that need to be met. The average rent in the UK is what, £1,200 a month. If you're getting a 5% increase in rent, you're getting like an extra £60 a month or £700 a year. You're not going to forego £1,800 in month in rent and costs on top of that to get rid of a good tenant to make an extra £60 a month. So it's really important.
I also agree. No, I agree with that
this
too.
dialogue about the fact that good tenants are served notice to squeeze a tiny extra bit of revenue is absolute nonsense. I'm sure there are a handful of case studies out there of morons who do run their portfolio like that. And actually, if they sat down and looked back at their accounts and looked at, oh, do you know what? If I'd kept these 2 tenants for 4 years each, rather than having 8 individual tenants on the same rent I put them in on, what would my figures look like? They'd probably very quickly discover they'd have made more money. But that is not how the vast majority of landlords work. 85% of all tenancies in England and Wales are ended by the tenant. Okay? 85%, not 10%, not 20%, 85%. And that's why when we talk about Section 21, I immediately think that this is the biggest load of hot air guff that we've ever talked about. It's this.
No, wait, Kristjan, hang on.
It's not going to deliver it.
I know that figure, 85% of tenancies are ended by the tenant, and of course that's how it should be, right? But there are 15% that aren't, and that's a lot of people.
But then when you drill down into that 15% and you look at why that 15% is moved out, we've already covered reoccupancy and selling, all right, which combined sits at around 7-8%. So we're getting into like 93 percentile. You now take out where a landlord uses a Section 21 as an easier way to remove a tenant than going through Section 8. They could do a Section 8 notice. So for those listening, Section 8 is when you pursue a tenant for a breach of contract, such as rent arrears or a core conditional break of a contract.
So sorry, what did you? I'm sorry if I missed that.
Sorry.
Did you just say Section 8, the actual Section 8 number? Do you know what percentage of tenancies are ended with Section 8?
So Section 8 is around 3%, but there is also a substantial chunk of Section 21 notices which are used as an easier route to secure
I know that,
than pursuing a Section 28, which they could legitimately do, but they choose not to because there is less burden on the landlord to end a tenancy for that reason. And so this is why also removing Section 21 will also restrict the choices for tenants moving into property, because one thing Section 21 gives a landlord is where a landlord is presented with a tenant where there is something questionable. It could be a CCJ in their history. It could be borderline affordability. It could be the fact that they've only just started a brand new job. Whatever it is, those little question marks where a landlord or their letting agent is generally on board, Section 21 currently gives them the added security of a simpler route to eviction should they breach contract and go, do you know what? I'm going to take a punt on this tenant. When you take that away from a landlord, what you're going to find is, and this is getting far worse because in a market with spiraling rents, affordability is getting pressurized even more, right, for people. But what you will now see is those borderline cases, predominantly around new jobs and affordability, landlords and letting agents will simply not be able to roll the dice on placing a tenancy with them because the risk will be too great. Because a landlord will not accept that selling is a legitimate way to get a tenant out of a property.
Okay, so from everything that you're saying, if I know you very well. I know how you feel and think about it, but I know a lot of people watching this will be thinking, so Kristjan, are you saying nothing should be changed, that there's no problem and that there aren't tenants who are having a life?
Frankly, I don't give a shit that Section 21's going. I think there is so much hype around it. I think fundamentally the market is going to not change at all. I think the change to the market will be nominal. I think for landlords, there will be an impact on the courts. There will be an increase of backlogs of getting cases heard in a court, legitimate cases. And that will make landlords and letting agents more cautious. I think another side effect of that is that on the side of landlords, rent warranties and legal expenses policies will just become industry standard, because that is the only way landlords can mitigate the vast majority of that risk. But I think for day-to-day tenants, the vast, as we said, 85% of tenants serve notice because of change of circumstances in their life, whatever, moving in with a partner, changing area, new job, hate their landlord, hate their property, whatever it is. That's not going to change. Those 85% of people will still be there. The landlords that need to sell, the landlords that need to move in, why is that going to change? It's not. It would just be done under a different title of notice. So, and the tenants who get evicted for severe and continual rent arrears, for antisocial behaviour impacting other people's lives, you know, these are people who should be removed from properties. They will still be removed. So there's going to be 2 or 3% of the market, realistically, that I think is going to be impacted. Now, look, 2 or 3% of 4 million is still what we're looking at, 12,000, or is that 12,000 or 120,000?
No. It's more than that. It's more than that. It's 2 or 3%. It's 25, 30,000.
No, 3%. Anyway, 120,000.
3% of 2 million. 3% of 2 million is 60,000.
Okay, yeah, so 120,000 because it's 4 million homes. So it'd be about 120,000 tenancies in the UK which are impacted. So I don't want to dismiss that 120,000 homes.
And as a percentage of homelessness, that's a very big figure.
But as a market, impacting 2%, I don't think anyone can say that a 2% impact on anything as a market analysis is a substantial impact.
So, bearing in mind this sentence I've got on the screen there, the caption at the bottom, are there any circumstances under which you think a tenant should be able to have a right to stay in their home if they've done nothing wrong? Or are you saying that should never exist?
But surely that's what you get with ownership. If you want indefinite right to stay, you buy a leasehold property. That's why we have leasehold in this country. A lot of nations don't have it.
You sidestepped my question, because that's just not an option for a lot of people. For a very large number of people, that's just not an option. You know.
Okay, so I mean, ask for longer tenancies. I mean, I've had this debate with tenants before who went, "Oh, I want to know that I'm safe in my home for 3 years." Offer your landlord a 3-year contract then, without a break clause. Now, the argument I have back when I've had these conversations with tenants in the past is, "Oh, but what if I want to leave in a year?"
No, I get that. I get that.
You can't have it both ways, right? You can't. There are plenty of landlords out there, particularly cash landlords, so which is roughly half the market. Okay, roughly half of all buy-to-let properties in the UK don't have a mortgage on them. Now, the reason I bring mortgages into it is mortgages sometimes have covenants that you can't place a tenancy of more than a year. Whereas, which actually that is probably going to change dramatically with the Renters Reform Bill, because with Section 21 going, mortgage lenders are going to have to accept that there are now indefinite tenancies. So the thing that was impossible will suddenly miraculously become possible because it's what they're going to have to work in. But for half of the landlords who own that property with no mortgage attached to it and therefore are not behest to the terms and conditions, most of those landlords are in a long-term view and would happily sign a 3-year contract with a tenant. You want that security. You want that.
If somebody wants to, for example, I want to raise my kids and know they're going to be in the same school. I want to live somewhere for 10 years. I'll pay my rent. I'll be good. I'll do everything else. What you're saying is tough shit. There's no opportunity for that. If you want that, you've got to buy.
Well, look, you can approach it. I mean, I think you'd be lucky to find a landlord that would enter a 10-year agreement with you, and also largely because then you reach capital values and stamp duty comes into play and all sorts of weird and wonderful nuances about how our industry works fundamentally. But again, that could easily be removed by the government to remove that hindrance. So I think you'd struggle to find a landlord that would enter a 10-year commitment. But we've placed 3 to 5 year contracts before.
Okay,
and
but I mean, I have a very strongly held opinion. It's purely an opinion that a tenant, especially with children, who's raising a family, working hard, struggling against the cost of living crisis, should not have a home move forced on them if they've done nothing wrong. And it's proven that countries that have those laws have much better social mobility and much lower cases of people just being derailed by because being forced, and especially if you're forced to move out and you cannot find anywhere else to live. That is people having their lives totally ruined through no fault of their own. And then they end up in temporary accommodation, or if they haven't got kids, they end up sleeping rough. Then there's this big misnomer that a lot of rough sleepers end up rough sleeping because they're drug users. Well, actually, it's the other way around. They became rough sleepers, and then because they were sleeping rough, they became drug users. Because once you're in that situation, well, shit, there's not much. It can't get much worse, can it? So you just get through one night at a time.
My view on this is quite simplistic in terms of I absolutely feel that people should have security in their home, but I think you should be willing to make a commitment in order to get that security back. All right. So I feel like any security you are demanding from a landlord is a security you should be willing to give that landlord. I want 10 years security. I'll give you a 10-year commitment. And I don't see why that should be balanced. Yes, it's serious. You've got kids, you make school commitment, great. If you want that,
you see, the other thing that might happen though. The thing that makes it unpractical for tenants to make that commitment is if they lose their job through no fault of their own and have to relocate for work. I get it. The landlord should be given the same protections, but this is why I think that 2 months just isn't enough time for anyone, landlord or tenant. It's it can take a while to find good tenants, and it can take a long time to find a good home.
The landlords, Charlie, tenants only have to give 1 month's notice.
Yeah, okay.
Let's not forget that. At the moment, tenants already get double what landlords get. So, which generally, look, I'm not getting out the violin for landlords. I think most landlords, and again, particularly in this market, 1 month's notice is typically absolutely fine. But you could argue in other markets when properties aren't flying out the door, 1 month's notice, particularly at a bad time of year for demand, could mean a landlord facing 2, 3, 4 month void off the back of that. So, but I'm not, I don't necessarily think that month's notice needs to be increased personally, and I think a 3 month notice for a tenant that's not at fault, I don't think that's difficult to work to. The only other thing I would say though is that a tenant signs a contract, whatever it is, a 12-month term, a 2-year term, whatever it is, that's your term.
Yeah.
That contract.
Yeah, that's okay. I think that works.
There isn't some lottery draw that suddenly goes, by the way, your tenancy ends in 2 months' time. Surprise! When you sign a tenancy agreement, you know what those terms are. You know whether there's a break clause or not, and how that is enactable, whether it's by you or the landlord or both of you. You know what the maximum term of the contract is. or you should know these things. You should not be signing a tenancy agreement where you do not understand these core structures. And therefore, yes, we could argue that a landlord should give 3 or 6 months notice. But fundamentally, the other way to look at this is if you really want that security, you could argue that a tenant should be having that conversation 6 months into each 1 year contract they're issued, saying, right, Mr. Letting Agent or Mrs. Landlady, whatever it is, guys, could you give me an idea? Are we all good for 6 months' time from now, as far as you know right now? Because if you think it's a maybe, I'm going to start hedging my bets and looking what's out there. But if you can say, no, as far as we're concerned, we're all good, keep paying your rent and you're good to stay indefinitely. So again, there are things that tenants can do to mitigate this. There is a structure to things. There is a contract in place. You know what those terms are. I've had tenants in the past demand to have a 6-month break clause in their contract and then absolutely lose it when the landlord enacts that 6-month contract, that 6-month break clause.
Yeah.
And it's like, but
I get that.
you demanded it was in there.
Yeah.
So
let's just, I've got a couple of comments. We've got some comments from people who are in the live stream. It'd be nice to. So actually, the first one is obviously from a landlord. Someone called Smashers on YouTube says, happy to scrap no fault evictions if landlords get more power to process tenants quicker if they fail to pay rent on time. Lost income from time taken to evict is a killer. Yeah, that's true. Rochelle Falcon.
The government is proposing about strengthening this stuff, but there's a lot of questions about the realities of that.
Yes.
But,
tenants want to, so Rochelle Falcon on YouTube says 100% agree. Tenants want a home, not to move every 2 years. I hate not knowing where I'll be having Christmas with my kids next year. I agree. That's a not a nice. Oopsie, wrong one. Sorry. We've got a follower here called Catherine who's being evicted. I did not choose to be evicted. That was posted earlier on in the conversation. We'll come back. She's got some questions actually. AM says, according to Shelter's report says a tenant is evicted every 3 minutes under Section 21. I heard that on the news this morning as well. Allied Property Management, which sounds like a lettings agent to me. Some of my landlords who are selling are also part of a generational shift. Got into the market in the 90s and now reaching retirement age. All right.
So this is the other thing, right? The property market's changed dramatically. I mean, in London, you know, when I started my estate agency career near 22 years ago, you know, it was commonplace. Property values were going bonkers. You know, prices, values on average in London were doubling every 8 years when I entered the market. So actually, you had a lot of landlords coming in, not really to be landlords, but just to give them the ability to hold that property for 5 to 8 years to double their equity and then exit. So that was a situation, Charlie, where you were looking at people more short-sighted, not 2 or 3 years, but 5 to 8 years, because they were like, hey, I'll buy for 250 grand. In 8 years' time, it's worth $500,000. As long as the rent pretty much covers my day-to-day obligations, happy days. It's not about making money on the rent. The exit is where I make my money. Now, in London, average property prices haven't really changed for about the last decade.
No,
really, not much.
Rusty Orange on YouTube. Kristjan, let me. I've got quite a few comments I want to get through here, so let me see if I can get through. So Rusty Orange just suffered a no fault eviction under Section 21. Landlord said he was going to sell. That comment's been cut short. Savkin says, "I'm one of those lucky tenants."
Changes by the government.
Say again.
I imagine that last comment was going on to say the landlord felt they were forced to sell because of the changes the government.
Right, yeah, okay. So Savkin says, I'm one of those lucky tenants asked to pay an extra £300 monthly or get out. It's a pleasure to see how they keep decreasing the asking rent price every 2 weeks, but still got no viewings. Okay, so this is someone who's saying he was kicked out because he refused to. So he sounds like he's got an example of one of those landlords being very short-sighted and trying to hike the rent. That
might be because the landlord's been misled by a media title. The landlord's got an unscrupulous agent who is either trying to keep or poach the business, or is just doing a poor job of going, hey, you can get 30% more rent without actually being able to back it up.
Someone here says, so got a renter here who is always worried about losing the family home, have got 2 kids in a local school. I mean, what do you do with your kids if you get evicted and can't find another home in the same catchment area? And
So,
then
I
this
mean,
is
my
a
question is
comment from a
ultimately, what have they
landlord.
done with that? Have they asked their landlord for a longer contract? Now, maybe they have,
That's
and
a
they've
good
been
idea.
told
Yeah.
this for a year.
So yeah, if you're still
But
watching, I'm afraid
that would be my main
I can't read Cantonese, so I don't know what that says. But the name is, if you're watching still, yeah, Christian's advice is very, very good there, which is just talk to your landlord and say, as far as you know, we good long term, and just for having an informal conversation to find out, just how secure you might be. There's no harm in asking through your agent or not. Nathan M, who I'm assuming is a landlord, says, "I'm afraid if you are renting, it is no family home." Well, I'm sorry,
I totally
I
disagree with
disagree
that
with that.
statement. That's absolute bullshit. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
As someone who's rented for 25 years, who's now raising 2 kids, that's absolute nonsense. A home is a home, and that you should feel at home regardless of your tenure, renting, owning, social, whatever. Your home should be your home.
Darren from Suffolk has a good question. He says, Christian says that they work with tenants who want to start proceedings. A tenant has to stop paying actual rent, though, to do this, surely.
Absolutely not. That is so wrong, it's ridiculous. No, they do not need to stop paying rent. They, in fact, absolutely should continue to fulfill the terms of the tenancy agreement. This is I don't know where this is going around the internet, but I've seen people have this line of thought, and also tenants thinking that if they want to go through fighting a Section 21 in court, the moment the legal proceedings start, they stop paying rent. Do not do that as a tenant. You will screw up your ability to rent because you're defaulting on a contract. You have the right to remain in a property after a Section 21 notice until evicted by a court-appointed bailiff, but you are still bound by the terms of the tenancy agreement until you are. So you should fulfill every single term, including paying your rent. And that is absolutely wrong. A council does not need you to be in arrears. That is a horrendous thing to be out there, because that will potentially put a CCJ against a tenant's name, basically making it impossible for them to rent in the future without a guarantor or basically years rent up front. No. Always fulfill the terms of your contract, regardless of what's happening.
Got a question from AM on YouTube. What if you do manage to find a landlord who will agree to a 3-year contract, but he then raises the rent massively at the end of the first year?
I mean, this is just hypothetical nonsense. I mean,
Yeah.
What if that tenant won the lottery prize halfway through that tenancy, and it wouldn't matter? That
No,
doesn't
Christian.
happen.
Christian, it's a fair question from people who don't understand. It's a fair question from
Okay.
people who don't understand the process, right? They
So,
say if we agree 3-year, I assume if it's a 3-year fixed term, you can actually agree to
if
fix
you have
rent
a
for the term,
3-year
can't you?
contract, one of two things will happen. Either the rent is set for that 3-year term and does not change, or there will be a rent review clause written into the contract, which will be something like, there will be a rent review every 12 months, which will be in line with market conditions. Or people sometimes turn it related to things like the rent retail price index. In London, quite a lot of people cite the Knight Frank lettings indices they have. They have prime central London and rest of London. Some people tie it into that. We've used that in long-term contracts for rent review clauses. But yeah, it will either be written what the review process is, and if not, that set rent for the full contractual term. That is the point of a contract. You can't change the terms of a contract.
This is a question. Yeah, okay. Thank you. That's helpful. This is a question from Thomas Moran, who asked, and let me answer this one first, Christian. I'd love to know your thoughts on it too. He says, why do you guys think that being a landlord, full stop, is okay? It's slavery, in my opinion. So, Thomas, you're a long-term viewer of the channel, and I'm aware of your feelings on this. My question is that, I mean, first of all, let's acknowledge the point of view here, which is that your work is paying someone else's income. I get that is the point of view. It's slavery because they're working, they're paying you rent, they're not getting anything for other, because they're back to zero each month. My question to you is, what choices where will people live if there were no landlords? I don't understand this. Where do people live? Because people do not come into society at working age in a position to buy a home. They just, generally speaking, don't do that. And also, there are many benefits to a tenant for renting. You've got a lot of flexibility. You can choose as your life changes. Maybe you meet a partner, maybe you don't meet a partner. Maybe you change careers, change jobs, want to move out of the country. All of these things. And also, as a tenant, you don't have the risk of major maintenance and repair bills because the landlord takes that risk. So there
But
are
also,
multiple benefits.
let's look at this a different way. Let's look at this a different way. They're talking about it because housing is something everyone needs, right? Everyone needs a roof over their head. Everyone needs to eat. So that means supermarkets shouldn't be allowed to make profit. Gas, electricity, and water, we all need those. So none of those companies should be allowed to make a profit. Like, if we're talking about what you need to live your life, great. Let's talk about this halcyon situation where none of the provisions of that are run at a profit. They are at a cost basis. Great. Let's move into that society. But that's not the society we live in. And what I find fascinating is that there are plenty of people who share Thomas's opinion, but interestingly don't bring food, water, electricity supplies, etc., into that same conversation. And I'm fascinated to understand why. Why is providing housing should be done at zero
But not
profit?
food.
Nothing else that we need. Why is that? Why is it okay that Tesco's makes hundreds of millions, even billions of profit putting food on our table? I genuinely just don't understand the disparity there.
Yeah, interesting point. Right, well, listen, that's been fantastic, Kristjan. Thank you very much. Really insightful as ever. I hope that's been helpful to everybody watching. If you want to find Kristjan, he's on Twitter, at Kristjan Byfield with a K. I've actually linked to I think I linked to it in the description below. But if I don't, you'll find him. Kristjan with a K. You'll see his name in the title of the video as well. And Kristjan's very vocal on Twitter. But I know you're always welcome to take questions, aren't you? You're always happy to have debates.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, reach out. Like I said, we've always, I am a tenant myself. We've built a letting agency around providing tenants with quality homes and getting a good service and working with professional landlords. So I'm very much on that side of things, but it has to work commercially, and there are certain realities. There are ideals that we could aspire to, but there are ideals that aren't in place anywhere else in our society. So there are some interesting expectations on landlords. And ultimately, if you want that to change, then it's government you need to talk to. Don't get angry with landlords. Landlords are working in the landscape that's been created by our last two governments, our current Conservative.
Oh, I agree. It's all down to legislation and policy. I agree.
Very much pushed it into this PRS landscape that we are in now. If you're not happy with that, don't shout and scream blue murder at landlords. Shout and scream blue murder at your MPs, at central government, at local housing, for not having any sort of housing strategy, for not having sorted out planning issues, for not delivering the homes that your community needs in the right places for the right types of people. That's who you should be angry with, not landlords.
Brilliant. Okay, great note. Great to note. Kristjan, you're a legend.
Charlie,
as ever.
Thanks,
Mate.
All
Talk
right.
to you soon.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.